Welcome. I'm Dr. Daniel Burns, Associate Professor of Politics and President of the Dallas Forum on Law, Politics, and Culture, formerly known as the American Public Philosophy Institute, or APPI. My predecessor, Dr. Christopher Wolfe, is unfortunately out of town today, enjoying retirement with his grandkids. Dr. Wolfe is the one who started this series of three-way conversations on hot-button issues. It's a series that he and I are particularly proud of. Let me just start by saying, unless you're planning to sneak out before 5, please do shuffle in a little bit so that people who come in late will have room to sit on the sides. And now we'll see who's planning to sneak out before 5. The Dallas Forum on Law, Politics, and Culture, which I just mentioned, is, I should say, an independent 501c3 supported in part by the University of Dallas. We sponsor intellectual programming both on campus and elsewhere, the goal of which is always to help anybody who wants to understand contemporary American public life in the light of timeless truths about human flourishing, always trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice. And today we have 3 speakers who are especially well suited to that. If you're not already on our mailing list, please check us out at dallasforum.org. Best way to hear more about events like this is to sign up for our email updates. And as long as I'm making announcements, if you're looking for extra credit for Dr. Sullivan's class, the sign-in sheet is in the back. Make sure you put your name on there. Today, and for the next over 3.5 hours, our topic is, should we be feminists? So it's not my job to interpret that question. You'll hear that from the speakers. Let me just say something about our format and then introduce them to you. This format, we're trying to open the water bottles of the speakers. 10 strong men have failed so far.
Extra credits.
We had to change the format a little bit because of our time shift with the ice storm. I think it'll still work well. We're going to start with opening statements by the 3 panelists of about 20 minutes each. From there, we're going to move straight into conversation among the 3 of them. That'll last till 5. Then, and most importantly, I forgot to put this in the ads, there will be refreshments. 5 to 5:15, we'll take a break. Our friends from Aramark will feed our bodies, and then we'll return to feed our minds. Ongoing conversation from 5:15 to 6:45, led by, this time by your own questions from the audience. So please save those for the second half. I hope most of you will be able to stay for it, but if you have to leave early, we are recording the whole event. It will be posted on our website at dallasforum.org. The point of these 3-way conversations is to have real dialogue between people who disagree with each other about some important topic in our public life. And we do especially try to pick topics on which this type of friendly dialogue is relatively rare. A few years ago we did inequality. Next year we did immigration. This year we're doing feminism. We picked 3 speakers, roughly on the model of left, right, and center, as limited as those categories always are. Everybody, of course, likes to define the center differently. On other college campuses, 2 of our 3 speakers have been labeled extremists. I just try to warn everybody about these things. We're not defining the center by the center of American college campuses. We're defining it roughly by the center of Texas. And most importantly, none of these 3 people was invited here to speak on behalf of or to represent any view other than their own. They're 3 fascinating people, each with their own independent takes on feminism, which you'll hear shortly. And so going in alphabetical order, Erika Bachiochi is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., which means her boss is indeed Dr. Ryan Anderson, whom some of you have taken classes from here. She got her BA at Middlebury College, where she studied political philosophy. Then, like the majority of our UD politics department, she got her MA at Boston College. And then she went a few stops down the Green Line to get her JD at Boston University. She's a legal scholar with expertise in civil rights law, in feminist theory, and abortion law. She's edited 2 books and quite recently published a book of her own called The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. You can find some flyers for it at the entrance. I'll just say, in our own political climate, the term pro-life feminism is often taken as a contradiction in terms. This book, Erika's book, represents the most serious defense of pro-life feminism written in a generation. She's also a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, right next door to Harvard University, where she runs a couple of projects that may be of interest to UD students that I want to mention. They have a 1-week student summer seminar called Man and Woman, Body and Soul in the Western Tradition. She's also brought a couple of flyers for that back. Applications are still open for that, and she co-teaches it with Dr. Angela Franks, who happens to have been valedictorian here in 1998. And they also offer, the Abigail Adams Institute also offers a new fellowship for young scholars who finished grad school and want to engage in serious scholarship even while prioritizing family life. As it happens, the first two joint recipients of that fellowship, Drs. Elizabeth Block and Emily Hine, both live in Irving and both also hold degrees from UD. In case that's not enough, 10 years ago, Erika co-founded St. Benedict Classical Academy in Natick, Mass, and has 7 kids. Richard Reeves is a very rare thing in Washington, D.C. I would call him a follower of Cicero, although he would probably prefer to say Mill. Whatever you want to call it, he is an actual expert in both political philosophy and real-life public policy. He has his Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Warwick in the UK. He has published a voluminous and fascinating intellectual biography of John Stuart Mill, who was, among many other things, I would say the first real philosopher of feminism. Richard has also held various positions in the...
Except for Wollstonecraft.
I agree with you.
So, this is a whole other conversation.
And we're off.
I like Wollstonecraft for everything that she is, but anyways. No, it's not a contradiction of anything you say in your book. Anyways, Richard has also held various positions in the policy world, up to and including the Director of Strategy for the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He's currently an endowed chair at the Brookings Institution, that is DC's most prominent left-of-center think tank, where he also directs the Future of the Middle Class initiative. His last book was called Dream Hoarders: How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That Is a Problem, and What to Do About It. Close quote. I think it's fair to characterize that book as the work of someone who, having grown up in Britain, undergrad at Oxford, worked for the UK government, when he moved to the US thought he at least would be escaping the British class system, was horrified to find that we have a class system almost as bad as Britain's, and very much wants to make Americans live up to the ideals that he had always thought our country stood for. He's also just completed a book coming out later this year called Of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why That Matters, and What We Should Do About It. He also has a wonderful podcast called Dialogues, which I'm quite jealous of. If I had a podcast, I would want to make it just like Richard's.
And which Erika's been?
Which Erika's been a guest on. Scott Yenor is a professor of political science at Boise State University, where he teaches political philosophy. You're sensing a theme here. He got his doctorate from Loyola Chicago, his BA from the University of Wisconsin. And so between Chicago and Wisconsin, he is very confused right now about the way that Texans react to 1/10 of an inch of ice on the ground. In addition to a book on David Hume, he has written not one but 2 books on the family and political philosophy: Family Politics, The Idea of Marriage in Modern Political Thought, and more recently, The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. If you're looking to read a root and branch critique of the whole feminist movement from its intellectual roots to its latest policy ideas, I don't know of a better book than both of Scott's, and especially this most recent one, which we don't have a flyer for it, but both Scott's and Erika's books related to feminism should soon be available in the UD bookstore. I think the ice may have delayed it a little bit, but if they're not already, they'll be there shortly. And once Richard's comes out in September, it will be as well. Scott has also held a visiting position at the Heritage Foundation, which is DC's most prominent right-of-center think tank, and whose new president happens to be a UD parent. Scott is a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute, where our own Dr. Tiffany Miller is also a fellow. And like our 2 other speakers, all 3 of them are frequently published, not only in scholarly publications, but also in popular journals on current topics. So they've all thought and written extensively on the topic we'll be discussing today. Read it, but more importantly, listen to them, because the 3 of them also just happen to be a lot of fun to talk to. So you'll see that now. Please join me in welcoming them, and we'll start with Erika.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here, and especially with my esteemed panelists here. I have a formal presentation, and I'm going to whip through it because we were given 30 minutes originally. Now we have 20, so I'm just going to speak really fast. I cut some of it, but. Okay, so should we be feminists? My answer, well, it depends. If by feminism we mean that, quote, woman is man's equal, was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she be recognized as such, I say, with the 19th century women's rights advocates who wrote these words, that yes, we should be feminists. These women courageously asserted their rights so that they might be better able to carry out their responsibilities to God, their families, and their communities. But if by feminism we mean, most fundamentally these days, that a woman has a putative right to take the life of her own nascent and vulnerable unborn child, I say no, we should not be feminists. But as I'll explain, I do not believe it is a feminist position to assert such a right. I think that both pro-choice feminist advocates and anti-feminist traditionalists share in a similar error. They both see feminism and the sexual revolution as one of a piece, with pro-choicers in favor of the package and traditionalists opposed. In my view, the sexual revolution of the 1970s, and specifically the abortion right taken to be the sine qua non of women's rights today, was actually a corruption of feminism. Rather, the efforts of the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848 is true feminism, or to define the term simply, the just assertion of women's equal civil and political rights. As my friend Mary Harrington put the same point more pithily, feminism did not begin but end with the sexual revolution. So let me now step back and flesh this all out. I want first to lay out for you the philosophical foundations of an authentic feminism that springs forth from both the common rational nature women and men share, as well as the consequential asymmetries of our sexually distinctive bodies. In order to get to questions of civil and political rights, we need to first ask who we are as human beings, as males and females. These questions are always implicit in any view of equality, of freedom, of rights, so I want to make them explicit, especially as I am here at UD, where your distinctive education predisposes you to think about things in this way. At first glance, it may seem that a person's views about feminism boil down to his or her answer to the following question: are men and women essentially the same, or are they essentially different? And notice I'm using the term essentially very much on purpose, concerning the essence or whatness of a thing in the Aristotelian sense. One could well posit that most feminists regard men and women as essentially the same, while all traditionalists view them as essentially different. On one brand of traditionalism, men and women have respectively masculine and feminine virtues that align with their masculine and feminine natures. By reason of their male and female bodies, they are meant to inhabit rigid and demarcated roles in the home and society that go far beyond the basic biological roles of mother and father. So, for instance, Rousseau, the quintessential traditionalist in this realm, regarded the distinctive male nature, Emile, as rational, strong, and active, and the distinctive female nature, Sophie, as weak, passive, and created specially for both modesty and, quote, man's delight. We still hear echoes of this Rousseauian view in some Christian circles today that speak of the complementarity of marriage as bringing together a man's head with a woman's heart as two halves of a single whole. I think this traditionalist view is wrong-headed, not just because of what it portends for women and men in the family and society, but also because it rests on a wrong-headed anthropology. But whether men and women are essentially the same or essentially different is a question older than even Rousseau, of course. It was, after all, one taken up by both Plato and Aristotle, too. Though it seems to me that, like Rousseau, neither Plato nor Aristotle arrived at a satisfactory conclusion. Unlike Rousseau, both ancient thinkers provide key insights to answering this particular question satisfactorily, or almost. So it seems as though it is correct to say with Plato and many feminists that men and women are essentially the same. That is, they both share the intellectual and moral capacities common to the rational being that a human being in his or her essence is. We sexually dimorphic humans are but a single species, after all. Specifying further, I'd add an insight from the late 18th century philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. Men and women are both rational creatures, for they did not create themselves, and as such they both share the same common human end or purpose, which is, in her view and in mine, to seek happiness through growth in wisdom and virtue. But I also think it's correct to say with Aristotle, and Wollstonecraft for that matter, that men and women are, as philosopher Prudence Allen observes, significantly different, most notably, of course, when it comes to their distinctive reproductive capacities, their powers of generation. As Aristotle well put it, women reproduce inside themselves, men outside themselves. Unfortunately, Aristotle's errors in other aspects of his biology prevented him from seeing that reproductive difference does not entail different rational capacities and therefore sexual inequality and hierarchy. Rousseau follows these errors of Aristotle despite having far better science by that time. Rather, as the 19th century women's rights advocates at Seneca Falls saw clearly following Wollstonecraft, it is our shared nature as rational creatures that provides the ground for our fundamental human equality. Thomas Aquinas, by the way, thought the same thing. But things are more complicated, and so we still need Aristotle, despite his deeply consequential biological error. For even as men and women share rational human souls in the Aristotelian rather than Christian sense, human beings are not unsexed souls who inhabit as a kind of appendage or own as a kind of property or tool their sexed bodies. These are the Cartesian and Lockean errors that haunt modern philosophy and underlie myriad errors in our own day. Even if we can conceptually differentiate, then, the rational soul that is common to man and woman from their distinctively sexed bodies, human beings are always and everywhere embodied, and therefore always and everywhere sexed. As Aristotle taught, each human being is a deeply integrated union of body and soul. So though the human being is essentially rational, he or she is also essentially sexed. And his or her sex impacts every aspect of the unity that is the person. Not only his or her sexually dimorphic reproductive organs by which his or her sex is defined. Though there are anomalies in the development of males and females, those reproductive differences impact women and men at the cellular, hormonal, and neurological levels too. And yet, though all women share physiological traits that differentiate them from all men, no two women or two men are exactly alike. That is, each particular man or woman lives out the integrated unity that is his or her sexed body and rational soul distinctively. This particular living out of one's sex is what makes each man and each woman, each person, unique, or part of what makes them unique. And so while differences between the sexes can be statistically significant and thus observable across large swaths of a population, such sex differences ought not legally confine particular individuals to particular social roles, professionally or personally. And so, for instance, while women are far more likely to want to be nurses, we ought not prohibit men from nursing, as we have in the past. For the specialized manner in which one develops one's rational capacities, one toward the humanities and teaching, another woodworking or engineering or homemaking, a third law, is a freedom proper to each person that depends upon his or her gifts, constraints, and circumstances, so long as one is employing such gifts for noble and lawful ends, and so for the common good of one's family and community. For this reason, I'm deeply grateful for the heroic anti-discrimination advocacy of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But there is a further complication still. The physiological distinctions of the male and female bodies are not only significantly different from one another, they are also asymmetrical. That is, there is a deep inequality at the heart of sexual difference. For when men and women engage in sexual intercourse, it is women who can get pregnant and not men. Again, as Aristotle rightly observed, women reproduce inside themselves and men outside. And it ineluctably follows from this basic biological fact that men can thereby walk away from the asymmetrical consequences of sex, while women cannot. And thus, it is with asymmetry that we truly get to the heart of the matter. The fact of reproductive asymmetry is why I think we must be feminists today. For Aristotle, it might be said that this independence from the consequences of sex, in addition to man's superior rationality in his view, is what made man a natural leader and woman a natural subject. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding or caring for young children are much more obviously encumbered with responsibilities to vulnerable other, which in turns makes them far more vulnerable and dependent themselves at those times. And such dependency was just the contrary of the independence required for deliberation and so for citizenship for Aristotle. But Plato didn't manage the sexual asymmetries of childbearing or pregnancy much better, even as he posited in the Republic, perhaps ironically, the equality of men and women. Guardian women, or we might say elite women, might be as free to work according to their talents as men are, but Plato-Socrates reports that to do so, they would have to enjoy, quote, an easygoing kind of childbearing, whereby their children are quickly swept away and cared for by lower classes of women, whose own children may have been sacrificed, he says, quote, if the flock is going to be of the most eminent quality. For Aristotle, then, women's childbearing bodies make them defective males. For Plato, women's childbearing bodies are an inconvenience to full equality that could be managed politically, for elite women anyway. These classic responses to asymmetry, especially when taken together, are philosophically coherent, perhaps, but they aren't particularly feminist in the way I've defended feminism, at least. We see echoes of them throughout Western history, but especially as we get to the early 20th century with Margaret Sanger. Women's childbearing bodies are the cause, Sanger tells us, not only of women's immiseration, but also of poverty, famine, even war. But with modern technological know-how, Sanger argues that the source of that immiseration, again, women's very bodies, could now be better managed if only we but have the will. Now, of course, traditionalists of the Christian rather than Rousseauian sort also have a response to reproductive asymmetry, one that is starkly different from the ancients and Sanger too. Indeed, traditional sexual mores that channel sex into lifelong marriage seek to ensure that a woman is not left alone with the unequal burdens of sex. Indeed, it was Christianity that first promoted monogamy too, demanding, unlike Rousseau, the same chastity of men that it did of women. The Christians' belief in the Imago Dei elevated the status of women, just as the belief in the Incarnation elevated the status of the body, and so childbearing too. And both beliefs elevated the work of mothers and fathers in their now eternally consequential task of inculcating virtue in their children. So the trouble for Christian traditionalists is not, in my view, their sexual ethic, which holds both men and women to a high moral standard, one which, due to the hormonally mediated asymmetries of sexual desire, is a far more difficult ask of men. Indeed, these asymmetries of both sexual desire and reproduction is precisely why the 19th century women's rights advocates similarly demanded a single high standard for both women and men up against the perennial sexual double standard. Advocating what they called voluntary motherhood, or a woman's legal right to say no to sex when she was not ready to become a mother, the earliest women's rights advocates also opposed both contraception and abortion. They not only abhorred the, quote, crime of abortion as a violent act against an innocent child to whom mothers properly owed duties of care, they also believed that by attempting to separate sex from childbearing, increasingly available abortion and nascent birth control methods tilted the sexual playing field further in the male direction, emboldening men to prioritize sexual intercourse and their own sexual satisfaction and to ignore the asymmetrical consequences of the act. In a word, these women demanded male chastity instead. Indeed, votes for women, chastity for men was actually a suffragist slogan. And yet, these insights were abandoned the very next century, just at that point in history when women were gaining the kind of influence in both the private and public spheres that could have made the expectation of male sexual integrity culturally normative. So if male chastity seems a just response to reproductive asymmetry, which I think it is, why not just be Christian? Why should we be feminist too? For well before the modern era, there were women philosophers like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century and Christine de Pizan in the 14th, who made robust cases for women's equality, engaging Aristotle's errors quite explicitly and grounding the equality of the sexes in the Imago Dei and thus women's shared rational nature with men. But it wasn't until the rise of liberalism, and especially the Industrial Revolution, that women in great numbers began to make a sustained case for their rights to property and contract, to the custody of their children, to entry into the professions, and to suffrage too. These women were condemned by some Christians at the time for speaking out in public, even against the horrors of slavery, for it was thought to be an unfeminine thing to do. So what was it about industrialization that inspired what I take to be the just quest for women's equal civil and political rights? Well, in the largely agrarian pre-industrial economy, the sphere of the home was quite large, and married women and men shared collaboratively in the productive work of subsistence. Sure, they made distinctive contributions in the work of the home based on differences of physical strength and reproduction, but they were deeply interdependent and mutually encumbered in their responsibilities to one another. But as men began to work as wage laborers in more urban industrializing settings, married women became increasingly dependent on their husbands for subsistence, even as their husbands were becoming increasingly independent of their wives for the same. More still, within less than a century, industrialization totally transformed the work of the home, trading women's productive labor of clothes spinning, for instance, into the far more consumerist and wage-dependent practice of clothes purchasing. This new economic dependence made women far more vulnerable to male exploits in the new city's bars and brothels, and to male abandonment and bad behavior generally. But women's legal subordination, which had yet gone virtually unchallenged during a time of subsistence living and existential interdependence, now stood sharply against increasingly dependent women. Should a woman need, for instance, to escape an alcoholic and abusive husband, remember the temperance movement was predominantly a female affair, it meant abandoning her children as well, as her husband would retain legal custody, and without her own wages, she had little means to provide for herself and her children. Thus, industrialization's sharp fissure between home and work brought the harsh realities of reproductive asymmetry to the fore in an altogether new way. And it is here that we begin to see the emergence of feminism, a movement dedicated to ensuring that women's distinctive needs and interests were met in a society that seemed increasingly hostile to them and to those of their children. Women's rights advocates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries sparred internally over whether such times called for women to be treated first and foremost as individuals, just as the newly emergent liberal philosophy treated men, or if women ought to be treated first and foremost as members of families, with special responsibilities to their children. Each perspective had a point, and the tensions and arguments between them inspired many of the workplace reforms in the early 20th century. In fact, anti-discrimination law, in its beginnings in the 1970s, managed to take both perspectives into account. Women, like men, had rational capacities and so ought not be prohibited from, for instance, settling an estate or practicing law or medicine. But they were also biologically different, with greater responsibilities in human reproduction. Legislation could licitly take that into account. All this softened the economic blows to poor and working class mothers especially, whose income was sometimes the only income their families enjoyed. And in my view, these and other measures are still very much needed today. But while these women's rights advocates were fighting for fair treatment in the industrial workplace, Sanger's technological response to reproductive asymmetry was simultaneously rearing its head, and she made no bones about it. Hers was the real solution to the problem. Just labor laws, voting rights, and other progressive era gains, those, she said, were mere palliatives. No, we had to get to the source. For throughout human history, well before the emergence of 19th century feminism, women had attempted all manner of means and methods to manage and even escape reproductive asymmetry. Asymmetry that again makes women vulnerable not only to physically stronger and more libidinous men, but also to the dangers and difficulties of childbearing. From nascent contraceptive methods to dangerous abortions, even to infanticide, desperate women have often resorted to desperate measures. Industrialization only made these pressures worse, with the New York Times in 1871 declaring the rising crime of abortion the, quote, evil of the age. Sanger's widely successful campaign for birth control in the next century, offered first as a prophylactic against abortion, fundamentally shifted our cultural response to reproductive asymmetry, no longer privileging male chastity and social supports for mothers, as 19th century feminists had, but instead the individual woman's duty, as Sanger put it, to technologically control her own fertility. Freed from their fertility, women could finally be freed from the burdens of sex, just like men. But Sanger's technological solution to reproductive asymmetry had unintended consequences. Consequences that the early women's rights advocates had intuited. Unmooring sex from its reproductive potential dramatically increased sexual risk-taking, both within, but even more so outside of marriage. With this increase in non-marital sexual activity came a spike in single motherhood and a growing demand for abortion too, whose legality eventually followed. And of course, all these unintended consequences impact women far more than men. And thus began the running together of the sexual revolution with 1970s feminism. Not only must women pump hormones into their bodies for decades to attain sexual equality with men, we are now told that women's, quote, equal citizenship, in Ginsburg's words, demands women have the right to end the lives of their unborn children. Note the fundamental reversal. The early women's rights advocates claimed their rights in part so they might be better fulfill their duties to their children. The chief trouble with the new feminist view is not only that it locates women's equality in a kind of imitation of irresponsible male abandonment, as though women through abortion are now, like men, able to walk away, or that it accepts as just violence and domination of the stronger over the weaker, or that it defines equal citizenship as exclusive of those with caregiving responsibilities, and so leaves unchallenged liberal theories in which non-wage earning women and their dependents are relegated to the margins of society, or even that it tends to place the needs and logic of the capitalistic market well ahead the nurture and care for the dependent and vulnerable. Do note, 50 years into the modern day feminist movement, pregnancy discrimination still runs rampant. But none of these injustices, as serious as they are, gets at the real fundamental trouble with a view of sexual equality that depends on abortion rights. Such a view, when it takes hold of a culture, eats away, slowly perhaps, but surely, at that culture's capacity to recognize and so authentically respond to the asymmetries at the very heart of the sexual relationship between men and women, though they remain there all the same. The abortion right is a kind of privileged response to these asymmetries, works to paper them over. And so we are surprised and shaken as a culture when 50 years into the modern feminist movement, both the Me Too movement and the billion-dollar sex trafficking and porn industries reveal just how frequently vicious men still sexually dominate and exploit women. If women's rights advocates in the 19th century work to undo the institutionalized male sexual prerogative by legal reforms to marriage and criminal law in the last century, relatively easy abortion access has emboldened the very worst of men to reclaim that prerogative once again. Can I conclude? Okay. Sorry. Woo! So where does that leave feminism today? Not in a very good way, I'm afraid. But I think there's a place to grasp hold from my observation of two distinct phenomena. First, more and more women are complaining not only about the casual sex ethic brought to us by the abortion-backed contraceptive revolution. Many millennials and Gen Z women are also up in arms, at least on TikTok, about the ill effects of hormonal contraceptives, and so are increasingly looking to natural methods instead. And second, more and more men are articulating a desire to be better, more engaged, more responsible fathers. These aspirations, I think, point to a way forward built upon the truth of human beings that abortion rights feminism and our consumerist liberal mindset has obscured from view. Both men and women are deeply embodied, interdependent, and relational beings who in their heart of hearts wish not for mere autonomy or even consequence-free sex. They wish for authentic human connection and ultimately deep and abiding love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here and for that very nice introduction. Can you all hear me okay? I agree with much of what you've just said, so I'm going to try and focus on where we perhaps might disagree. But as you've already heard, we have some political philosophers on the panel. And I think it was Bertrand Russell who was asked, who was a famous British philosopher, who was asked, what is it that philosophers actually do? Some young person, I think, was thinking about going to college. So, well, what do philosophers do? And Russell said, well, in the morning, we clarify a few concepts. In the afternoon, we make a few distinctions. It's a living. So that's what I'm going to do, clarify a few concepts, make a few distinctions. And I think that, I hope that we'll spend quite a bit of time on this question of whether we're emphasizing the ways in which men and women are the same or the ways in which we are different. Because I think on that hinges so much of what you've just heard from Erika, and certainly what I'm going to talk about too. It's a great topic. It's a very topical topic. In 2017, Merriam-Webster announced that their word of the year, based on Google searches, was in fact feminist. There was a 70% higher, I may have been getting some of this from your book, I don't know, 70% increase in searches for the word feminism, spurred by the Women's March in January, the Me Too movement, but also the film Wonder Woman. So a mixed bag as to why it happened. So I'm going to make some distinctions around feminism before defending a version of it. And of course, we're all going to say a version of it depends. So the main distinction I'm going to draw, which I think is similar in some ways to the ones that Erika has just set out, is between what I'm going to call feminism as an ideology and feminism as an equality movement. I think one of the best definitions of ideological feminism has been provided by Jessica Valenti. She's a leading contemporary feminist. She's the founder of feministing.com. And she writes the following, quotes, "Feminism is a structural analysis of a world that oppresses women, an ideology based on the notion that patriarchy exists and that it needs to end." That's very different to what I'll call, for now, an egalitarian idea, which is much closer to what we've just been hearing about, of securing equal opportunities, which animated second wave feminism and many of the advocates of the 60s and 70s, but going much further back too, I would argue, to John Stuart Mill and others. And I think that much of Justice Ginsburg's work was also largely in this tradition of creating more equal opportunities, substantively equal opportunities. And this difference between feminism as an ideology and feminism as a movement for equality is a difference of kind. It's not just one of degree. I'm just going to draw out a few of the differences that are really going to matter for me in terms of my argument. The first thing is that an egalitarian movement can achieve its goals. It's something that can end. And in fact, in many areas of life, arguably, it has achieved many of its goals. Just look at the transformation that we've seen in education and in economy in recent decades. In 1979, 13% of women earned more than the median man. Today, 40% of women earn more than the median man. The wage distributions look very similar when you look at them now. That is not to say that there is no gender pay gap at the median, but it is to say that the transformation in the wage distribution of women by comparison to men has been rather extraordinary. We could look at the gap in attainment of four-year college degrees in the US, which is wider today than it was in 1972 when the Title IX legislation was passed to promote gender equality. It's just the other way around. Women have overtaken men at every level of education and now outpace men on college campuses by more than men did the other way around in 1972. An ideology, by contrast, has a sort of fixed way of looking at the world. In this case, the world is a patriarchy. It sets up an almost endless and unending struggle. I was reminded a bit of Kenneth Minogue's work here. Kenneth Minogue is a conservative critic of liberalism, and as a liberal I try to read as many conservative critics as I can. And at the end of his book, The Liberal Mind, he compares liberals to St. George, who's unable to retire. And so the picture here is St. George slays the big dragon, slays another big dragon, slays a couple of other big dragons. And it's really job done, but it can't settle down. And so goes looking for smaller and smaller and smaller dragons to slay, even as he goes into his dotage. And Minogue's view is that this is what liberals have done, is they've basically won all the big battles. They've slayed all the big dragons, but they can't retire. They have to keep finding smaller and smaller dragons to slay. And there's a little bit of truth in that here too. I think there's a danger that we forget that many of the big dragons have, if not been slain, they're at least in trouble. And so for feminists like Jessica Valenti, but I'd also add someone like Amir Srinivasan, her recent work on the right to sex, for them, they will explicitly say that nations like Finland and Iceland are patriarchal societies. And I think I know what they mean by that and some of the cultural difficulties that are still there, but it seems to me that if Kabul and Helsinki are both patriarchal societies, something's been lost in the utility of the term. So that's one big difference. Does it end or not? The second difference is that as an egalitarian movement, egalitarian feminism is generally more about substantive rights and opportunities, many of which you've just heard about, whereas ideological feminism is more about culture. In fact, it has to become more about culture over time. An example would be in the idea of rape culture, including on college campuses, but just in more general, it's more of a cultural movement. It'll become about behavior, microaggressions, etc. So it becomes more about what kind of posters are on the wall of the science lab, rather than the sign on the science lab's door saying women not allowed. And so if egalitarian feminism is about access, ideological feminism is more about attitudes. I'm going to be nicer about feminism in a moment, the other version. Third big difference is that an egalitarian movement, I think, and this is crucial for me, is framed mostly in positive terms, whereas an ideology is almost necessarily in negative terms. So an egalitarian movement is about increasing opportunities, not so much reducing oppression, except to the extent that they're related. It's for women's rights, not against patriarchy. Of course, this means tackling norms and barriers and so on. I'm not suggesting that we should be Panglossian, but at root, this egalitarian idea is an expansive concept. It's one that in the end doesn't really require villains, whereas ideology has to be about the bad guys, guys used deliberately in this sense here. Egalitarianism is about opportunity, ideology is about oppression. And I think that negative aspect to it is important. And this actually came out from one of the other reasons there was a spike in searches in 2017, was when Kellyanne Conway told CPAC that she now found it difficult to call herself a feminist. She was struggling with exactly the question that we're talking about today. And she said the following: it's because it seems to be very anti-male. I see myself as a product of my choices, not a victim of my circumstances. And to me, that's what conservative feminism is all about. I think part of the question we have here is whether there is such a thing, as I think Erika just asked. The fourth big difference is that egalitarian feminism speaks to, I think, a broadly shared set of values, exactly as you've just heard, whereas the other is a minority opinion. And this is just factually true. So let's get some statistics here. Only a minority of American women and British women now describe themselves as a feminist. According to most surveys, depending on how you ask the question, you get different answers, but let's say it's about 1 in 3. 2/3 will say that they are not. But in 2018, YouGov did something quite interesting, and it asked the American women who did not identify as a feminist, who are in the majority now, why they didn't do so. Half of them said it was because feminists are too extreme. Half of them said it was because the current wave of feminism does not represent true feminism. Now, what's true feminism then? And 1 in 4 because feminists are anti-men. This is a problem for a movement that's trying to change the world. Most women agree with the following statement: I believe in equality for men and women, but I wouldn't describe myself as a feminist. This is a problem for some organizations. In 2015, the Fawcett Society, which is the leading women's rights organization in the UK, did a huge survey. And most British women still believe that more needs to be done to get more equality between men and women, but only 9% describe themselves as a feminist. The Fawcett Society said that this showed the nation to be, quotes, a nation of hidden feminists. The chief executive of Fawcett said, the simple truth is if you want a more equal society for men and women, then you are in fact a feminist. Note that she said women and men, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment, and the possibility of gender inequality running both ways. But that's obviously not true if we adopt the ideological version of feminism. A couple more distinctions which overlap. One is, and I won't say much about this because I think Eric's covered some of it already, between feminism as an abstract intellectual movement of laws and rights and concepts, and one that is more respectful of the lived embodied experience of women and men as men. And secondly, between a feminist vision that negates nature, at the most extreme seeks to abolish those distinctions altogether, and a feminism that recognizes and even celebrates some differences, on average, between men and women. It's this question of sameness or difference. This is what I think I want to spend the remainder of my time on. How much time do I have? About halfway through? Sameness is what I want to spend a bit of time on. Because it's quite clear that we are very similar in many ways. In fact, arguably in most ways that matter. And the emphasis on our sameness has been a very important part of the movement towards equality. But we're also very different in ways too. The question's like, in what ways are we different? What are the implications of those differences? Do those differences have legal implications? Do they have structural implications in terms of access to institutions? I would argue largely not, with a few exceptions around things like pregnancy, discrimination, etc. But should they lead us to believe that under conditions of genuine substantive equality, we may see different patterns emerge? And that doesn't mean that we're still in a patriarchy. That some differences can emerge, these different patterned choices, but not because they're enforced, but because they are chosen. And it seems to me that's the goal. We have to get to that point. I'll give a couple of examples. The so-called STEM paradox. It appears to be the case that the most gender egalitarian countries in the world are also the ones where you have biggest gaps in STEM interests and STEM occupational choices between men and women, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And so in Scandinavian countries, for example, women are less likely to go into STEM fields than in much less equal countries. And I think the plausible explanation of that is that under conditions of greater equality, people can just start to choose more freely. They can start to allow their preferences to shape the pattern. Another example Erika's already mentioned, the preference is perhaps to care for very young children. There is clearly a difference there. And so you'd see under conditions of real equality, differences in the choices that men and women will make. And that's okay. But it doesn't mean that we change the law, It doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't give equal access to paid leave to fathers as well as to mothers, as I argue very strongly that we should. It might mean that the fathers take it at a different time. In fact, I argue in my forthcoming book that it looks like fathers are actually really pretty good with adolescents. And so you can imagine a world where mums do tots and dads do teens. And that's okay, right? It takes a heck of a long time to raise kids, as we all know. It's a long, long journey. It's not done in 2 years or whatever. And so the challenge, I think, is if we take some of these differences and we solidify them into law, or they become so strongly associated with certain norms that it's hard to escape them. So let's give another example. Risk-taking. Men are more risk-taking than women, especially in adolescence. It's well established. This makes evolutionary sense. It is why, after all, we have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. And that is true. It takes a bit of thinking about, but we have twice as many female as male ancestors because the reproductive success of men is so low by comparison to women, which means that it makes more sense to take a risk. If you've got a risk of being an evolutionary zero, it's worth risking a great deal to try and succeed reproductively. And so there's good evolutionary reasons why you might see differences around risk. And so that's concerning because you see risk-taking behaviors among men, and young men especially, is a problem. It's a public health problem. It's certainly a problem as a father if you've raised 3 sons to their 20s as I have, and we made it, thank God. But there's another side to it too, which is that because men are a bit more risk-taking, because there are these slightly different patterns, every year the Carnegie Foundation gives out awards for bravery. People who have risked their own lives are often given their own lives to save the life of another, usually a stranger. They are almost all men, young men. And that is not for want of trying. And so, everything else equal, will we see more men doing some of these riskier things? Being more attracted to some of these risks? Yes. But it won't be 100%. So the difficulty then is, like, where's the equilibrium point? And I'm really influenced by some recent work which attempts to look at occupational choice. And what this work does is by Rong Su, is the name of the scholar, is to look at what would the occupational segregation look like under conditions of reasonable assumptions of choice. Given what we know about differences in personality between men and women, women are a bit more into people, men are a bit more into things, right? It's basically true, but the distributions overlap a lot. And what she finds is that what you'd expect probably is about 30% of engineers would be women, and probably about the same percentage of nurses would be men, right? So that's not 50%. That's okay. But it's not the 3% women engineers we had until only a couple of decades ago. And so we have to be quite careful here. What we're trying to find is, like, where are the patterns that we can feel pretty confident emerge from real choice. So the only other thing I want to do is to say that we can allow difference to emerge in the patterns as a result of differences without fetishizing those differences. And the problem with the political debate right now is that the left and the right get into this kind of polarizing dynamic where the more that conservatives insist on just how consequential and huge these biological differences are between men and women, and sometimes, at worst, use it to justify gender inequality in a way that you absolutely do not, but some conservatives do. And then the left, in response, has to deny that there are any differences at all. Right? There are no differences, we're all blank slates. And both sides just end up making fools of themselves, because everybody who's actually been in the world knows that there are differences, but anybody also knows that the distributions overlap. The distributions overlap. And so we can think both those things at once. And that's the kind of feminism that we want. And so I think, in my view, we should see feminism as the female-focused arm of a broader gender equality movement. And my final point will be that has to be one that treats inequalities in both directions. And so we have to be careful at this point, where we've made so much progress, to allow in the possibility that there are some gender equalities where boys and men are now the ones that are disadvantaged. I've already mentioned education. There are many others. But this is something that actually contemporary feminism is really struggling with. You'll see in the creation of the White House Gender Equality Council and the first ever national gender equality strategy, which came out recently. It's a voluminous piece of work. It's going to have annual reports and so on. It doesn't mention a single gender inequality that affects boys or men. It's entirely asymmetric. So you should have kept it what it used to be called, which is the Council on Girls and Women, and maybe create a Council on Boys and Men, or have a Gender Equality Council that is what it says it is, and that can deal with both. I'm very worried about the fact that we have such low female representation in our politics, much lower than in Mexico, for example, or even Jordan. So it's a problem that we have low levels of female representation in politics, and indeed venture capital, and so on. But it's also a problem when we have such high suicide rates among our young boys, when we see them falling behind in education, and when we don't take seriously the differences in the way that boys' and girls' brains develop, especially in adolescence. We can think two thoughts at once. We have to expand feminism so that it can become part of a movement that is encompassing of boys and men, and not in opposition to them. We need a pro-social model of masculinity for what is increasingly a post-feminist age. So if feminism is defined the way I think it should be, along the lines we've just described, the answer to the question of whether we should be feminists is clearly yes. But if feminism is not, if it continues to be defined in more ideological terms and oppositional terms, then I think that we're all in very great trouble, and that feminism itself has gone very badly awry and has deviated from its founding principles. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys all for coming out. Thank you, Dan, for having us, and Rachel. Thank you for all the work that you did in getting us here. I appreciate it. The huge snowstorm you guys had and the remnants of it are just really impressive. And how you guys made it out today, it's really, really amazing. So thank you for coming out. I now live in Idaho, where we have about 12 feet of snow. And we still go to school, but that's fine. So yes, I mean, I get to back clean up. In some ways, I'm just kind of surprised how much agreement there is. So I'm gonna I'll end that a little bit. But so the reason I got interested in studying feminism was that, as Daniel said, I'm a political philosophy guy, and I'm part of a school of thought that looks at political philosophy in this kind of dichotomy between ancients and moderns. And we see the moderns as having several different principles, but one of the main principles is that they're really concerned about conquering nature. That is, taking natural differences or natural observations and like putting human beings in control of them so that we can be free. Nature will no longer be an obstacle, but rather it's an opportunity for us to kind of use nature for our purposes. And the beginnings of this school of thought are in Niccolò Machiavelli and Francis Bacon, Descartes. Descartes says he aspires to make man lords and masters of nature. And it's easy to see feminism as an outgrowth of that. You know, the body is part of nature. It's given. And we need to own the body. We need to make the body what it will be for our purposes. And in my first book, it was written 15 years ago now, I covered feminism just as one of the outgrowths of this modern movement. Had one chapter on it. And you can kind of see that feminists are interested in overcoming the sexual difference. They're even interested in overcoming reproduction, which is one of these very natural processes that we have as human beings. They're interested in overcoming what you could call the natural family. I don't really buy into that, but that human beings should have choice over the terms and duration of their marriages. And so it really seems that feminism is kind of an outgrowth of this modern attempt to conquer nature. And you see that especially, I think, in today's feminism, the ideological feminism that Richard was talking about. Here's how I define feminism, and this is from the ideological feminists. This is from Kate Millett, who wrote in the late 60s, part of what they call the second wave of feminism. I don't think there's that much of a difference among the waves, but we can get to that later. She says there are three pillars to feminism. The first pillar is that we need to put an end, she says, to patriarchal socialization. We need to put an end to patriarchal socialization. And what she means by patriarchal socialization is really any manifest difference that emerges between men and women is traceable to a kind of education that women get under conditions of patriarchy. She expects, I think, she says, that the differences between men and women will kind of disappear or wither as we put institutions in place to end patriarchal socialization. I think she expects a 50-50 world. And you'll see this in many of the feminists who've written in the last 50 years. And we can talk about that, but that's the first pillar, the end of patriarchal socialization. The second pillar of feminism is the establishment of the independent woman and the independent child. These things, I think, are related. Now, this is a term of art. What is meant by independent is not dependent, all right? And not dependent on any particular man for the destiny of that woman. And no woman should feel like she has special responsibility for a child, so you also have to think of children as independent if you're going to achieve female independence from the family. So she doesn't have any special duty, the male doesn't have any special duty. This is an important and very expansive principle, the independence of women and children from the family. And the third pillar of feminism, according to Millett, is the end of all sexual taboos. So she kind of ships the whole sexual revolution into the feminist revolution. And what she means by that is we have to break the idea that sex is connected to marriage and childbearing, but rather sex should be celebrated in every various way it can be experienced. You know, the idea that most people are heterosexual is really connected to marriage, because we channel sexuality in that particular way. If we got rid of all the rules and expectations on our sexual expression, you know, who knows what kind of sexual expression we'd have, but it would be much more, you know, evenly divided between homosexual and heterosexual orientations. Certainly, you know, she goes all the way down. You know, she's like pedophilia. That's a taboo that needs to be gotten rid of, and who knows how people will express their sexuality, but it can't be channeled toward marriage, right? So we're going to end sexual taboos. That's the third pillar. Now, I like how Richard talked about this because I totally agree with how he talked about it. I call this in my book the rolling revolution. Each one of these principles is impossible to achieve. It will achieve greater and greater, smaller and smaller obstacles that are met with greater and greater fury in order to eliminate those obstacles. The revolution to achieve these goals is just an ongoing effort. And the reason it's impossible and must be ongoing is that all three of these principles contradict human nature. That is, there are elements of our bodies, of our psyches, of our persons that are just permanent parts of who we are, that this particular revolution has to keep churning and trying to eliminate, but always meets another obstacle. So it needs to have another role, and the revolution continues on. It's without end. It's a rolling revolution. So in the beginning, all we want to do is achieve independence of children from the family so mothers don't feel so obligated. So we establish public schools, and then we establish universal daycare, and then we haven't done all these things, but then we abolish homeschooling. Like some countries have done that, some states make it very difficult to do, right? And all of that is to establish the independence of children from the family. They're going to get sex ed at school. And after that, there'll be another role on the revolution. We can almost predict what they'll be, right? So it's a never-ending churning and a rolling revolution to achieve these goals. And as I say, each of the goals contradicts human nature. Richard kind of stole some of my thunder on this, so I can kind of skip over it a little bit. But human beings are not independent. None of us are independent. Men aren't independent. Women aren't independent. We're all at least partly political beings and social beings who need one another in order to thrive and live. So the idea that women are going to achieve independence because men have always had it, contradicts the actual nature of how human beings as social and political beings live our lives. Ending patriarchal socialization, that ain't going to happen because it's not socialization. Some of it is just the natural difference between men and women. The examples about STEM, or the examples of men liking things and women liking people, those are very common and very well established in both scientific literature and with your eyes, if you allow yourself to notice. So we're always going to run into more and more sexual differences that need to be eliminated if we think of all differences as the products of patriarchal socialization. And while we've ended a lot of sexual taboos, I like to say we're not even halfway there. Like, everyone continues to wear clothes, right? Like, what a taboo. And I always close the door when I go to the bathroom. Not my kids don't. But that's another problem. That's a problem of patriarchal socialization. The patriarch hasn't socialized these kids as well as he needs to. So, we rarely copulate in public, right? Just like, take all of these examples. If there's going to be no taboos, these things would have to go. So we're not even halfway there. I mean, we've made a lot of progress. And why is that? Well, the sex difference is there. Human beings are dependent. And human beings, for all of our boldness, have a modesty about us. We have a distinction between private and public things that we actually maintain in our lives, and there are certain things that are private. And we go to the wedding, but we don't follow the bride and groom. Augustine talks about that, but that's good. So we have this kind of contradiction, I would say. We have a officially feminist culture that initiates the rolling revolution, but we have this fact that it can't ever complete itself because the obstacles of nature are tough nuts to crack. So what we end up having is a feminist interpretation for all of the natural things that still exist. We have a feminist culture that runs up against nature. Now, so let's talk about this, and I guess I want to go back to the STEM example. I think the big difference between Richard and Erika on the one hand and me on the other hand is going to be this. I don't think there's such a thing as choice. And I don't think there's such a thing as neutral ground within which human beings make choices. I'm more of a Platonic guy. I think all human societies are caves, and we have opinions that help govern and direct our lives. Our laws can be officially neutral, I guess. I mean, we can talk about this. But culture and expectations will always be thrust upon men, women, individuals for how they should live and how they should prioritize things in their lives. And that my suggestion would be is that our cave is a feminist cave. And I think that cave, but I don't think like the option is a feminist cave or no cave. I don't think there's a neutral ground where human beings will just be free to make choices. Our choices will always be shaped, right? And in the modern world, our choices are shaped by a lot of things. Feminism is one of the aspects or one of the features. I didn't check when I started. When did I start? Do I have like? All right, good. I'll keep it from now on. All right, that's good. I'll have to put my glasses on here. So our cave is shaped by a multitude of factions. So let's go back to the STEM example that Richard gave before. I said I wasn't going to react to anyone's stuff, but so it's very true that I've seen other studies on the same thing. It's really interesting. The highest rate of female engineers in the world is in Arab countries, where they're governed by necessity. For every one female engineer, there's like 2 or 3 male engineers. Whereas when you go to Scandinavia, I've seen different numbers, but there it's like 1 to 4 or 1 to 5, depending on the circumstance. But they had actually been more equal earlier. So there is a way of sorting out jobs that happens under different conditions. But one thing you can see in the nations that are governed by feminist doctrines is declines of birth rates and later marriage rates. Everyone is free to choose, but it's like a magnet is directing everyone to make the same choice. Later, fewer, right? Everyone now thinks Like every country, it's not only legal, but encouraged to do like the little practice marriage. Living together is perfectly acceptable outside of marriage. Like, how did that happen all at the same time in all these different countries, right? Our choices are shaped. What is more important or central to your identity? If I can use that term. I don't like that term. Let me use a different term. What's going to be more important to how you prioritize the goods in your life? Your career or your marriage? Same thing over the course of time in Western countries that are dominated by feminist thinking. The marriage is less important, and we usually talk about careers instead of mothers, fathers, taking care of children. So it's interesting, in this realm of free choice, and you can see it in certain aspects like the STEM field, men and women sort themselves out differently. But you see the same kind of prioritizing of career over family life, fewer children as a result, later marriage as a result. It really does suggest that our culture, whether it's laws or not, our culture really does shape the way everyone chooses. And to me, the important question is the way our culture shapes choice conducive to individual happiness for men and women and societal happiness? Does it lead to better people, happier people, and a better political community? Now, that's of course a very hard thing to figure out, but to me, it's a cop-out to say it's choice. Now that means, unfortunately, that I think liberalism is kind of like a not totally true doctrine, right? I don't think you can have your liberalism and your Plato's cave. It's one or the other. Either our choices are shaped and we have poets behind us who are helping instruct us as to what is good and how we should prioritize goods, or we're free to choose. Are we chained beings sitting in a chair, or are we free without chains? And if we're free without chains, if we're chained beings, the only interesting question becomes, what are the best chains? All right. So with that in mind, I think we should have some cautionary tales. We should have some cautionary tales about what the end, that is the end goal or the end destination of feminism is for human beings. Now, I'm going to pick like a really bad example here in order to shame feminism, I suppose. But let's look at Korea. Korea is the country that I think, these things change all the time and there's different ways of measuring it, that has the lowest birth rate in the world. I've seen Singapore, but the last stat I saw on this was that South Korea's birth rate is 0.83. Right now, with a 0.83 birth rate, that means the country halves in size every generation. Okay? Now, that suggests people aren't having children, can we agree? But how about this? They're not having sex. The recent surveys out of Korea are that 58% of people in their 20s have had sex in the last year. Now, that includes married people and unmarried people. It's like almost half the people haven't had sex in the last year in the country. And it seems that men and women don't have a taste for one another in Korea. Here's what I mean by that. Women think the men are a bunch of wimps, and men think the women are unlovable. The voting patterns in Korea are like red America, blue America, but based on sex. So, like, men vote for the conservative anti-feminist party. At the last election suggested like 3/4 of them, whereas women do the opposite on the progressive feminist party. Right? And like men think this isn't good for them. Now that we cannot take for granted that men and women will continue to have a taste for one another. And what I'm suggesting here is that one of the destinations of feminist thinking is to undermine or create hostility between men and women, not only to undermine the idea that they're going to have children and make it less likely they're going to have children, but also to put a real wrench in the sexual dance that has been, part of great literature and human life for the whole part of human existence. Like, that's a very interesting thing to write novels and books on. People should be going to Korea and writing about that. But you know what? We won't. And you know why we won't? Because we can't notice. And you know why we can't notice? Because we have a culture. We have a culture shaped by the principles of feminism. Now, I think lesser versions of the same thing can be found in all Western democracies. That is, I don't think we don't have a neutral culture. We have a culture that is shaped by the principles of ideological feminism. But then the tragedy is, if I can put it like this very sharply, Richard, there is no such thing as egalitarian feminism, because there's no neutral ground. So the question is, how do we shape? I think conservatives have been really bad on this, because conservatives have been standing athwart feminism for generations and yelling nature back. Like, no, it's always how you interpret nature that matters. What our feminist culture is a particular way of interpreting nature that tries to achieve more independence, tries to eliminate more difference, and tries to eliminate more taboos. We find injustices through the lens that feminism has provided us. That's how we find injustices. That's how we figure out what we're going to do. We're going to get more STEM majors who are females. Right? We actually never say we're going to get more male nurses. We don't have, all right, you do, yeah, we don't have many programs for that on the campus. It's only in the engineering school. My proposal on this is that we should learn to, I should say, the big question is, do we go with the grain of nature and say, men are different in this way, and our culture should encourage them to achieve the kind of virtues that they can, given their natures? Or do we fight against it and try to transform both men and women toward the ideas that feminism has put forward? I think we should get comfortable with male-dominated professions and female-dominated professions. And I think we should have a societal project to try to get people to prioritize motherhood and fatherhood over their careers. That's the way to combat feminism. It's not with an egalitarian feminism, but with a non-feminism that is kind of a family first and prioritizing of going with the grain of nature instead of running counter to nature. Thank you.
I want to start by asking the three of you what questions you'd like to ask each other. Where do you think, what have you been waiting to push the other person on?
Yeah, I have a question for Scott, actually. So I agreed with you a lot, Scott, both of you a lot, which is kind of funny. There's too much agreement here for this debate.
I'll get on that.
You'll get that. Okay. So I agree with. I think we all have problems with sort of the latest modern feminist ideology, as I think Richard articulated very well. So I guess my question is that it seems to me as though some of what you were diagnosing is more sees the millets of the world as more successful than they are, and that the real problem, or one of the real problems, is just careerism writ large. So consumerism, materialism, individualism writ large across and then add in also sort of technology as being the destabilizing, why are men and women not engaging in sex and career or whatever, just the ubiquity of technology sort of, and tech and apps to find dates and all that stuff. So I just wonder if there's a way in which your diagnosis is almost ideological in a way, that whereas the ideological feminist sees patriarchy as the kind of problem, that your diagnosis is feminism is the problem. And to me it seems I think we agree, it seems a lot on, I don't know, I guess we could push you more about, what you think the law should do. I think maybe we all agree that the law ought not sort of you know,
Stay out of it.
yeah, the law, right. So, I mean, I think the law is a teacher, so I take your point a lot. But I just wonder if there are other elements that come out of liberalism itself, so we can all pile on Richard now as you know, the million of the group. But
I'm waking up now.
but like that liberalism and the sort of careerist, individualist, you know, the autonomy, like the sort of mythical autonomous man that then the, you know, feminist, like all of that is a problem with liberalism and sort of late capitalism versus this successful sort of Millet. I just don't know that she was, there are people who believe what Millet believes, but I think it's like this sliver of people.
Is
this on?
Yes, it's on, yeah.
It's just for
the recording.
Right, well, yeah, well, I think that careerism comes from feminism.
Not from liberalism.
Yeah, I think careerism comes from feminism. So to me, the culprit, we invest a lot of our meaning and identity in careers, and that argument is sewn into I would say, the Ur-book of American second-wave feminism, Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, which I say is the career mystique. Like it replaces the feminine mystique with the career mystique. At the end of the book, she says, basically, you can't really have an interesting life if you're a mother or just a mother, but you can if you find creative work outside the home in a bureaucracy or in, you know, in art, performing arts and other things. And I think she's just following Beauvoir on that, whose last chapter of The Second Sex is named The Independent Woman, and it's about careerism. I think careerism has been the tool that feminism has used to transform both men and women. I would say before that, men thought of themselves not as careerists, but as having jobs. Just mundane things like having jobs and being providers. But that whole idea suggests that the family is the thing that you're providing for. The career isn't the thing that's most important. Now, I can't prove this. I wasn't there. It's how some people like Hegel talks about jobs like that, and certainly Tocqueville talks about things like, talks about it in these terms. So now, that being said, I think of feminism as kind of a dependent variable in a way. I look at it in the stream of modernity, right, and about the process of conquering nature. And that has a lot of different manifestations. Obviously, technology is an independent variable that can be used and urbanization, which I think you emphasized in your talk, is also part of the project of harnessing nature, conquering nature. We no longer need so many people on the land. We can conquer nature in moving to cities and having Isengard and all these other places that will be fueled by trees and such. And so I think all of that is part of it. And I'm very opposed to monocausal things. Very opposed to monocausal things. But I want to put feminism on the table as you know, the chief transformative ideology of our age. It's going to be more difficult to do anything about urbanization.
Right. Well, let me just come back, because I think you're right in, you know, largely about Friedan, but I think she also had a really important insight, and that is that women were, I mean, I sort of already spelled it out in my presentation, but that women were ailing because of becoming basically, as she says, like the chief consumer. Like America is about business, and women are now, because of industrialization, taking all the productive work of the home, other than, of course, the important work of rearing children, but that they'd become the chief, you know, consumer, you know, and out figuring out how to buy the best possible dishwasher and then scrubbing their floors 300 times a day. So like the work of the home had gone from incredibly productive to consumptive work. And so what she wanted was actually not career. She says career is part of the trap. I mean, there's a quote there where she says that, but that she wants productive work. Now, obviously she has many contradictions in that work where she talks about like the homemaker as a parasite and all that, totally grant that. But I think there's a way where she's looking to help women have like a purpose that is productive again. And yes, I mean, that could be homeschooling, that could be, you know, all sorts of other things that don't have to do with bringing in money, and I think she's okay with that. You know, she's okay with like the PT, working at the PTA or having some sort of, I mean, she talks a lot about going in and out of work, like there should be flexible work. So that you can go in and out and prioritize family. I mean, so she actually, at least in the first edition, says all of that. So I think, to me, there's more of a move, and I'm all for, I mean, your recommendation at the end is exactly my recommendation, which is that all of us ought to be valorizing motherhood and fatherhood before career. Why? Because it's the most important thing we do, clearly, but it's the underpinning of the rest of culture anyway.
Okay, so I'm having a bit of whiplash. I spend most of my time arguing with people to my left. And so I just sort of realized, I should have gone last. Because there's a few things. Like one is, okay, well, I argue a lot with people who think that we live in a patriarchal culture, a rape culture, etc. And I've just argued quite strongly against those positions. Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say, Scott, is we live in a feminist culture, right? And so on the one hand, I'm trying to obviously both can't be right, and I think it's part of this issue, which is like, and we don't. I mean, most young Americans think the ideal arrangement when you've got young kids is for mum to work part-time and dad to work full-time. That's young Americans today. That's not feminist culture. In fact, a lot of feminists are very disappointed with those numbers. They're like, really? And they're very disappointed with the fact that kind of women go and get these MBAs, and then 15 years later, half of them are working part-time. Why? Because they're looking after their kids. They're like, oh, what's wrong with these people? And so, on the one hand, you've got that, and so I don't see the triumph of feminist culture in a way. I think I strongly agree with that. I do think that in senior reaches of government and in some parts of the world, and I've criticized the White House Council and stuff, but I just think most people are just normal. And they're getting on with their life. And careerism is, you know, being able to feed your kids. And they know we're different, but we're not that different. And they certainly don't think that their son shouldn't be able to be a nurse or their daughter shouldn't be able to be an engineer. And they also think, probably, that their daughter should be able to choose marriage and choose to exit marriage. And I think this is something we might talk about, because one of the fundamental insights of Steinem and on the others was absolutely what you said, which is economic independence of women from men. I disagree that they argued that they were trying to make children independent of them. But I think the central point of, I want you to be able to choose marriage. I want you to be able to exit the marriage. I do not want women, and I'm saying this now, but so would Steinem, I do not want women to be forced by economic conditions to stay in a bad marriage or choose marriage. Gloria Steinem recently got married, in a hilarious little side note, to Christian Bale's father. And she said, because I can now, because we've made so much progress, that I feel pretty confident that it's a choice and kind of stuff. So I think that's, and so Gloria Steinem got married, right? Having spent most of her career saying, you know, women, because she felt it was a choice. And I think the incredible increase in the economic power of women in the last 40 or 50 years is one of the most magnificent achievements of modern history. It doesn't mean that these women aren't choosing marriage. In fact, one of the most interesting things about the US is the most economically powerful women, probably in the history of the world, college-educated American women, are the most likely to get married and stay married. So they're not taking their economic independence and running away from marriage. They're getting married and staying married. So it's not like they don't want to get married, but they, I believe, and we've got plenty of people in the audience who can disagree, they don't want to be forced into it. They don't want to have to do it. And they want to know that if he does walk out, they can feed their kids. Because they don't want to declare independence from their kids, they want to look after their kids, by and large. That's my experience. So I just think on both sides there's this sort of, we're missing the kind of the middle. And then, can I say two more things? I know I'm on a rant. I promise I'll be quick. The question of careerism, there is, I'm going to cite Claudia Golden's work here. We have this problem, we structure jobs and career trajectories in a way that just not very compatible with raising kids. Right. And that's because they were done by men whose wives were raising kids, right? So you had a free, you buy one, get one free model of the labor market. But there are professions where we actually solve some of those problems and where we don't penalize people as much for taking time out at critical points. So in pharmacy, for example, there's almost no pay gap, gender pay gap. There's still a massive one in law and in finance. Why? Because in your 30s, you've got to make partner, you've got to put in non-linear hours, you've got to get on planes, you've got to do all that. And people who are raising young children don't want to do that, disproportionately women, huge impact on gender equality. But we can redesign our career structures in a way that help both women and men to not face such a trade-off. There will always be a trade-off between raising your kids and making the money that you need to raise your kids. But we unnecessarily make that trade-off sharp with the way our labor market institutions work right now. I better stop.
Let me just ask Erika and Scott to respond, particularly to that point. Is it to be celebrated that women have greater independence and greater economic ability to exit marriages, to divorce if they want to,
Or choose not to marry.
or choose not to marry? Right. This is.
Yeah, I would say no. I would say no. So yeah, let's be clear about that. I don't know. You want to say no, or you want me to?
I have a more
I'll hang my. You're going to say maybe or something. Yeah, I mean, all these things are really complicated because of the difference between men and women. One of the things that's really interesting, say about divorce, is that so people we want to say that people are free to leave, and that has real downstream effects, so that it destabilizes the institution, and it makes living together without being married more acceptable, and because you've destabilized the idea that marriage is an enduring thing, so now we'll take a more fleeting thing, and that's going to get a kind of blessing. And then it makes it easier, once again, downstream, for people to have kids outside of wedlock, to have it be normal. And like those relationships and that part of the country ain't doing so well, as you know better than anyone. When you destabilize the whole institution of marriage at the top, people can, I think it's very interesting that the neo-traditional marriages at the top of America's economic food chain are as stable as they were 40 years ago, right? Almost as many, like people get divorced now as got divorced in 1980 for the upper quintiles or things like that. Yeah. And almost none of them have children out of wedlock, but no one defends marriage. Right. And what's happened is downstream from that is just suffering. And those are the people committing suicide. Those are the people who don't have marriage as a lodestar to give certain kinds of meaning to their lives and roles and meaning to their labor. And without that, there's a real suffering. So, if the upper class does so well with intact marriages, well, let's roll back the divorce laws a little bit. I mean, it's an opportunity, but there's another way to look at the divorce thing. And it's true that women are freer, and they use their freedom. I mean, I think the number is, 70% of divorces are filed for by women? And it's rarely, just according to the numbers, when you look at the ranked reasons for it, it's usually minor things as opposed to abuse and alcoholism. It's like irreconcilable differences or emotional distance. And I'm just going to let you know, every man is emotionally distant, and which means, and men depend on women for the community that they have within marriage, for the friends that they have within marriage. So generally, men do worse emotionally after marriage, and women do worse financially after marriage. And the power, no one expected this. When you look at the divorce, the no-fault divorce regulations that were passed in the early 70s, no one said, oh, women are unstable and fickle and they'll just get out of the marriages. No, it was always about how this is going to help women get out from cheating husbands who were going to shack up with their secretaries or something. And the old divorce laws, they tried to teach responsibility to men and stability to women. And when you remove those laws, you shape men and women's character differently. So the new laws shape and, I would say, exacerbate some of the vices of women and some of the vices of men. Men aren't responsible, and women are less stable. They're not the stable partners in marriage. We thought they were the stable partners. So I think it's too simple to say. For me, you have to look at the question of divorce regulation. We can do this with all the laws. You have to look at the question of divorce regulations through the lens of how is this going to shape men, how is it going to shape women, and how is it going to shape marriage. Like those are the ways you'd ask the question, given the different natures of them, and given what is sought to be accomplished in marriage, which is to have it last and have it be like capable of accomplishing things.
Yeah, can I? Yeah, so I actually agree with both of you and disagree with both of you. So,
Great.
Okay, so I think agree with Richard that economic independence for women has been very important with regard to the freedom to choose to enter marriage. So, I mean, this is one of Wollstonecraft's big points, but this is obviously just part of history, is that prior to women being able to enter into the professions, et cetera, be able to like earn wages, contract law, et cetera, or contract rights, et cetera, that they literally had marriage or prostitution in some instances, right? And so, you know, there was the bargaining that the father would do for the marriage in the upper classes, and there was, you know, women having to do more unsavory things in the lower classes. So I think the economic independence before marriage is really important, which is why, you know, it's good that women are here getting a college education and then hopefully having some skills so that they can then earn money in order to choose their mate wisely. However, I think it's very important within marriage for women to be free to depend upon their husband to earn money because of the dependence that they take on when they are rearing children. And so how do they get that? Well, exactly Scott's point, which is you tighten up the marriage laws. So it's harder to exit. Now, it's not harder to exit for abuse, et cetera, but the no-fault divorce laws are, so in other words, allow for some economic independence, of course before marriage, but then even within marriage with good, you know, I talk a lot about part-time pay equity, those kinds of things that allow women to keep kind of some sort of, you know, foot in the job market in case, not only if their husband abandons them or their marriage goes bad, but if they, you know, their husband dies or gets sick or all sorts of other reasons that they may need to then, you know, or they lose their work, et cetera. So I think that, you know, the reason why we went for no-fault divorce was part of, you know, the feminist plea for it, but it was also that there was this belief in this, that there was sort of duplicity that was brought to the court. So with fault, when we had fault, there was this idea that, you know, the man and the woman would decide there are irreconcilable differences, we don't love each other anymore, so let's go and pretend to the court that we can, that we really, you know, that there's some reason we give, whatever that reason is, we sign off on it and we go our separate ways. And there were some who argued that that was bad for the law, and, you know, it made people, you know, not, I don't know, think seriously about law or whatever. And that was just we should have allowed the duplicity to happen, right? Because of the teaching authority and the way the law teaches. So I think that's another important point. My final point, I guess, with regard to Scott is I disagree, and I've heard you say this before when I've listened to, you know, just this idea of that men are not emotionally available or you know, I think that men and women in marriage learn from one another to be the kind of spouse that the other needs. So I think men learn to become more emotionally, I mean, I happen to have a husband who's like incredibly emotionally available, so like I lucked out, there's my daughter. So, you know, maybe he's a rare breed, but I also think there's a way in which when you love another, you sit and you listen and you know, and then from my, you know, from the woman's perspective, that maybe there's, you know, whatever it is that she needs to learn to be a better spouse for her, you know, husband. So I think that there's, you know, Brad Wilcox has great work about like the happiest marriages are those in which men are emotionally engaged. So there are men out there who are emotionally engaged, and in those marriages, especially, this is in Bella Sahil's book, where, you know, men who hold egalitarian views about marriage and about their spouse tend to have these marriages tend to be more solid marriages that last longer. Yeah. So I just think that there's a way in which, you know, men, it's not like, oh, they do all the dishes all the time and there's like some 50-50 split, but just like paying attention, being part of the family, being deeply engaged in the lives of their children, being deeply engaged in the lives of their, you know, instead of like going off and playing golf or going out and hanging with the guys all the time, which was a model, I think, of marriage and is different from the model that I see, at least among young people, that young people want today.
Yeah. Can I add one point? It's a question for both of you, I think. You just used the phrase, so you've quoted the statistics correctly, as far as I understand it, which is that divorce rates are dropping among those who are more educated and so on, even with the rise of no-fault divorce. But Erika just used the phrase, women should be independent, be able to choose, etc., but that we should allow them to be dependent within the marriage on the husband if they choose to do more of the child, which is actually what we see happening. I mean, that's just the revealed preference we see happening, right? And I can't look at the patterns of care of young children, I'm emphasizing young children here, and think that that's the result of patriarchal socialization. I mean, it seems kind of clear to me that the pattern is a result of genuine choice now, right? Maybe you could argue it wasn't 50 years ago. But who's disallowing it? I mean, I was actually economically dependent on my wife for quite a while I was raising our kids at home. Was I allowed to do that? Who's trying to disallow any of this? And so it's this kind of weird debate that we're having here, and it's part of the result of ideological feminism. Because if you think there's a group out there who are saying women must not be allowed to stay at home and look after their children and depend on their husband, that's not allowed. It's against the ideology. Well, of course, that's absurd, and we should fight that. But I don't think there's very many people saying that. I think most of us are just raising our kids. I raised my kids for a bit. My wife raised our kids for a bit. I relied on her salary. She relied on my salary. Sometimes we do it together. We try and raise our kids. We stumble along. And so it's like, real people aren't living in these ideological struggles, and no one's disallowing women from... Like,
right, but economic conditions, I think, disallow it sometimes.
In what way?
And so, well, because if there's no way for a woman and a man to live on 1 or 1.5 salaries, especially in lower classes, I think that becomes very difficult. Right. And if there's a worry about being left, so if you don't have if you don't have fault divorce laws, whatever, the old laws that protect you in a marriage, then you may be more apt to, I always say, and this may sound obnoxious to you, but I always say, I'm glad I married a man who believes in hell.
Because you were going to give it to him? You set it up.
I mean, it was good. And no, I do. But no, but just in the sense that, like, I know he's not going to abandon me and our 7 children because he knows that there's some sort of like eternal repercussions that aren't just the blame that people in society will have for him, right? Okay. So, but I think there's not. There are other women who obviously worry about that more, and they worry about the straying of their husband, their spouse. They worry about the behaviors of their potential spouse, and so they're then going to need to stay in the job market more because of the worry of this.
Sure. So if we're going to have massive family allowances and higher wages and stuff, then I think we're going to loudly agree with each other. Probably. That's an interesting debate within conservatism right now as to how far the state should step in and massively top up the incomes of families to allow those sorts of choices, even if that means that more women do it. I think that is kind of a super interesting debate that's kind of taking place right now. But I think it's this question of like allowing and disallowing the kind of the dependence or the independence, and just allowing people to choose like within it. It's like why I think both sides sometimes come across as lacking a bit of faith in the ability of people to figure out what they want and then go and make it happen. In your case, that was to find that kind of husband, and for other people, it will be something different. There's almost, I'll stop. Scott,
I mean, I'll just say a couple things. So, I mean, I won't respond to the either you're married or you're a prostitute. I don't think that. I mean, that's not my position. I think the idea of financial independence before marriage, or even the potential financial independence before marriage, is kind of an ideological thing. That is, I think that's not as key of a variable for, once again, 80% of the population as it is for the college educated who make it important. That ultimately, I think, to go to the hell point, marriage is a question of character. And whether or not you have the ability to stick with someone over the long term. And I also did the same thing you did, apparently. For 4 years I was raising the kids. And you can write a dissertation when you do that. And so it worked out great. And what the flexibility that was necessary there was something that wouldn't have been there before. But like, this wasn't about financial independence before. Like, it's about like we're going to stick it out no matter what, together against the world. Like that kind of character. And you know, and what in our society promotes that? Like, I think there's a decline in the character that is necessary to sustain marriage. And I think, you know, being financially independent and thinking about it in those terms, I don't think that's like high on the list ultimately for what makes people stick it out and be fruitful and over the course of time. And what it takes to actually get to that point is kind of a societal education project that we've abandoned, I think, because of the ideological categories of feminism are so central to the education. And we'll have to talk about why that is, but I don't want to monopolize.
I want to follow up on that point and about societal education, because I think this might be an interesting way to tease out some more of the differences between the three of you. And I should admit, you know, we talked about Erika's 7 kids, but Scott has 5 and Richard has 3. Nobody has a parental slacker up here,
I feel like it now.
We're above replacement rate in all marriages. And in particular, I want to talk about the formation of young men, because Scott brought it up, and I think all 3 of you have opinions on it. In fact, I know you do, because I've read all 3. What is it that our culture right now is not doing well, in your view, when it comes to forming immature masculinity into mature masculinity? Because it seems to me that may relate to the differences between the 3 of you as to the strengths and weaknesses of feminism. What does it take on the level of not just the family, but on the level of a whole culture to form men into the kind of men we want them to be? Anybody?
Since you're writing the book on
Since I've just sent the book to the publisher. I just want to just make one final point on the issue of divorce, because there's a fascinating paper which looks at the variation between states in whether or not the wealth of the couples is shared equally on divorce. The paper's called Marriage as Collateral, and what it does is it kind of it de-risks somewhat the person choosing to take time out of the labour market, because if the marriage then ends, they get half the wealth, basically. And some states have that and some don't. What they find is that in the states where there's less risk, mums stay home more. Which is a really interesting example, I think, because I think we should all be pleased about that, shouldn't we? I think that's what we can really agree about, which is like, okay, so we're in this together, we're building the wealth together. You might be in the labour market right now, but we are building this wealth together, we're raising these kids together. And so if we split, we're going to divide the wealth between us. And with that security, women are more likely to stay at home and raise their kids. And I just don't think you can be against that from either side of the debate, honestly. And it's just a really good specific example. On boys, I have three sons, and this is a big part of my book. I think it's something we shouldn't do. And one is your definition of mature and immature masculinity is incredibly important. Right, because there are these differences in maturation rates, and I think it's a much more positive way to think about it, right? The headmaster of Stowe School in the UK said, my job is to create young men who will be acceptable at a dance and invaluable in a shipwreck. And that was 100 years ago. But you kind of knew what he was getting at there, right? It was something about socialization, but it was also something about if necessary, they're going to have the courage to do it. So much better than toxic, non-toxic. The phrase toxic masculinity has to be consigned to the trash can. It's just a horrible phrase, right? It's got it. You see, when I'm at the other audiences, that's not the reaction I get. This is great.
Richard, you really are conservative. You just don't know it.
I'll talk about toxic femininity.
Well, we don't. I mean, but there are aspects of both masculinity and femininity that, taken to extremes, could be seen as toxic. I mean, look at the way that adolescent girls bully each other on social media. Right. That's pretty toxic, and it's something that girls do. There's toxic femininity as a result of TikTok and stuff, right? But we don't talk about it that way, because what we're talking about is natural elements, what it means to be male and female, which differ on average, and I've talked about some of them. We've talked about risk-taking, we've talked about sex, we've talked about people, things. We've covered quite a few of them. And say that there's something bad about that intrinsically. Right? There's nothing wrong with it. If it's not channeled correctly, if you don't learn how to sex drive is a great example, right? Part of growing up is how do you manage your sex drive? And that's a bigger challenge for young men. But what we don't do is make them feel bad about it. And I sometimes worry that the only kind of desire that's kind of no longer acceptable is the desire of a man for a woman. It's like every other kind of desire is great now. And I think every other kind of desire is great, by the way. And the conditions of equality, we'll see what will pan out, and most people will straight, and it'll be fine. No one's going to die. But I think the idea that we take things like risk-taking, we make it toxic. So don't do that. I want my boys to be proud of who they are, and that includes the parts of them that are masculine. And by the way, some of my sons are much more masculine than others, and you'll see the same, they overlap. But it's like, this is who you are. And that, I think, in the end, is, I think progress is this way, we probably slightly do disagree, is like chains, no chains. I actually think, as a liberal, million liberal now, I would argue that our behavior is a result of a whole series of things, but most obviously our biology, our culture, and our own individual agency. Sometimes you've got to go to the restroom. You use that example, so I'll use it too, but you close the door. Right? The first is biology, it's nature calling, literally. The second is culture, and thank you for doing it. And there'll be other cultures that won't do it. But there's also a bit of agency, which is I can wait 10 minutes because I'm on a panel, right? Or and over time, it is 10 minutes, right? Over time, and I see this as progress, and we may disagree here. The balance shifts from biology to culture to more individuality. It is not that we can escape culture. That's crazy to think that we can escape culture. But culture can be somewhat de-weighted relative to individuals. So you're raised in a very strong religious tradition and so on. You're clearly going to be shaped by that, and that's great. But you're also going to have more freedom if you choose later to maybe exit it or do it differently and so on too. And that seems to me to be pretty much the definition of liberal progress, is to, over time, not demolish nature or degrade culture, because nature makes culture even more important, because, as you said, that's how we channel it. But we are putting more weight on individual agency. And I think that's good. And it's always going to be a balance, but that's a good thing. So it's not chains or no chains, it's weaker chains.
We talk about what the formation of young men?
Yeah, I call it shaped choice. Yeah, yeah, and yeah. So I mean, I'll say that generally what I recommend and what I practiced. I had 4 boys and 1 girl, and they're all adults, or not all of them are adults, but 3 of them are adults, and all married and having kids already. And it's that my philosophy is go with the grain, don't go against the grain of the male nature. So if males are more competitive, all right, channel that competition into very productive things. They're more risk-taking. Here's the risks we're going to take. Yeah. Like, I jump off cliffs now. Yeah. Like, I don't like that. And but like I put something in my mouth and I just do it, right? And like, I never shot guns. Like, I shoot guns. They go out and shoot guns with them, and they really appreciate that. Like taking a 12-year-old out and destroying a bag or having a milk carton explode, they like that. And so, yeah, they are making me more masculine because I'm effete. And you know, and you know, the same thing, but always talking about, all right, like what does it take to be a father? Talking about what that father's doing. We're talking about what that father's doing. Like that's the priority. I never talk to them about college. I don't care about your grades. I don't care what school you go to. You know, I just don't care. And because the culture will emphasize all that stuff. No one will emphasize the family for your kids. So I did that with all my boys, and with my daughter, same thing. Go with the grain, and not against the grain. So that's what I call a non-feminist or an anti-feminist education, right? There's nothing wrong with there's nothing inherently wrong with what you're going to be, but it has to be shaped and pointed in the right direction. And you know, I'm relatively happy with how things turned out, but my impression is, I've helped found a classical Christian school in Boise, and I'm the chairman of the board of it, and I've been that for 20 years or so. And I wanted to make sure that my kids had an education that didn't actively harm what I was trying to do, and which is the very low bar that I think that I would adopt as a parent. Just do no harm as a school. And my studies of the public schools suggest that they do harm on these things in both directions. And so the project of educating both young men and young girls, but I think the girls are actually harder to raise than the guys, because the social pressures are greater on girls than guys, and guys are just in the main less taken with public opinion than women are. Women are more agreeable and more social than men, generally, and therefore they're more likely to imbibe their opinions from the culture around them than guys are. So it's just harder, I think, when it comes to girls, so I've been blessed to have 4 boys.
So should we take a break, or do you want me to try to answer in 3 minutes?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I have 3 boys and 4 girls. And yeah, I think have a very similar philosophy, and I have one boy who's smack in the middle of the 2 other boys, who is incredibly, I guess you'd say, sort of classically masculine, like has tons of energy, goes all the time, and had a lot of problems with sort of self-control as a young kid. So the thing that I always said to him, which was like, basically, and it's sort of, I think of, the classical sort of ordering of desires, right? So the desires are good, sort of, but we just got to order them. And so this is very similar to what you have said, but so I'd always say to him, like, you have this enormous power in you. It's amazing, it's awesome, and so we need to direct it toward the good. So not like kicking me while I'm driving or throwing things or something like that, but we're directing it to the good. And so there was one moment at which JJ, hi JJ, you could see him, and so I talk a ton about self-mastery. It's all about mastering yourself. Like, you are the master, you know what I mean? Not mastering nature in that way, but like the sort of classical understanding of self-mastery. And so it's also in like very small things. So in table manners, like I always talk to them about how you're not animals, you're human beings, right, Lucy? We talk a lot about that. And so what is it to be an animal versus a human being? I mean, it's really the ability to sort of take your desires, reflect, and then make choices, right? So I remember one time he had always just had this propensity to move and quickly and, hurt people and things like that. And I remember him kind of coming and stopping and like pulling back. And I was like, all right, we've won, right? And since then he's gotten much better at, mastering himself. But I think that is part of it, is like, because of the risk-taking nature, because of the testosterone that's blasting through them. I mean, it's like helping them to also see that they're not like girls in school who can like sit forever sometimes, and they do have to move around, and like that's not a bad thing at all, but we have to take all this, like these juices that are like humming through you, and direct them to the good. So lots of sports for that kid, Anyway, I think that's all.
We're going to take a 15-minute break.